my baby. And I'm here for George because I want justice for him.
We cannot look at this as an isolated incident.
This isn't stained by someone in Minneapolis. It's still got a shine on it.
Will you defund the Minneapolis Police Department?
Get rid of the police, defund the police. It's a slogan.
At the end of the day, what we have here is a loss of trust.
We were in the middle of COVID. We were risking our family's life. 3 weeks later, we are now vilified and hated.
But the problem with that is we still have to address George Floyd.
I was more appalled by the three that watched than I was the one that pressed.
You had to learn how to be a human being to the community that you serve.
If I have to teach you to be human, you shouldn't be hired to be a police officer.
I buy the fact that maybe he went off the rails. It's a hard job. What I don't get about that, the police records were falsified. That goes all the way up the system. Hello, we want to welcome you to a very needed conversation. It's themed Conversations with America. We welcome you to be a part of this conversation as we create a climate and an opportunity for expression, for development, for education, for the growth of our country and our communities, and the resolution of some of the many problems and the tempestuous atmosphere in which we find ourselves living today. The last time I had a conversation with America, it was after 5 police officers had been shot down in the streets of Dallas. This week we've had some atrocities and some painful things to go through as a people.
Do we want to change? Do we really want to change?
The eyes of the world are upon us right now.
Everybody has a choice to make every day how they're going to live their lives. We had that conversation. It was a very emotional conversation. Many people wept and opened up and began to talk. Life is so fragile.
He suffered.
Have you had any moment to grieve?
I woke up this morning and I felt lost.
It doesn't matter the color of our skin. We are with you. You cannot have a conversation that's just one-sided. You have to have a conversation that's two-sided. And it occurred to me that everybody's talking to the protesters and everybody's talking to the press, but I don't see many people talking to the police officers. And so we're having this conversation with seasoned professionals today so that we can have some resolution. There are no stereotypical police officers. We've seen some great images. We've seen images of police officers kneeling with protesters, praying together. We've seen police officers join in with the protesters and go the extra mile to bring peace in situations. But we've also seen some images that were disturbing. We've seen brutality and we've seen tear gas sprayed on protesters that weren't doing anything. We've seen reporters just doing their job, getting arrested, and in other cases, getting physically accosted. We've seen an old man pushed down in the street, 75 years old, and walk past. So we've seen all of these different images. What does it mean for our community? What does it mean for our streets? Where do we go from here, and how do we get there? Those are the kinds of conversations we're going to have today, and we've got an esteemed group of panelists here today to help shape that process and help shape that concept. Most of them are in the room. A couple of them are joining us online. I've got a whole cadre of smart and professional people who are ready to dive into this conversation. Let me tell you who we've got. Take a look at this.
Terrance Hopkins, Mike Mata, Ricardo Campbell, Interim Chief Jaime Ayala, Sean Smith, Preston Gilstrap, Dr. Delvena Thomas, Vincent Hunter, Cynthia Parker-Ferguson, and Cedric Simon.
When you start talking about scenes and you start talking about environments and you start talking about situations, you start looking back at moments and you question it in your own mind, what would I do in any given situation? There was a particular scene that I'm really, really curious to jump into to better understand. When you're in that moment, it's one thing to watch it on TV and say what you ought to do, but when you're in that moment, how do you handle these kinds of situations? This particular case that really drew my attention centers around a senior gentleman that seemed to be pretty easygoing, pretty passive, and take a look over here at the screens and see what happened. Aside from the gentleman being pushed down, the thing that was amazing to me is that when one of the officers got ready to reach down for him, the other one pushed him away and he kept walking. And it made me wonder about the fraternity amongst police officers. I assume you don't have to be a police officer to want to help somebody who's hurting. And I assume that his humanity just kicked in and he wanted to be a help. The question in my mind is the fraternity of the police officer compromised if he has a moment of humanity and wants to do something as simple as reach down and help somebody up? And I know that many of you have been on the force, served on the force. I know some of you are serving on the force currently. I want you to just open up and talk to me about what that looks like to you and explain what we just saw.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here.
Glad to have you.
I think the first thing that we need to realize in there is that you had an officer or a group of officers that put the mission above their oath. Mm-hmm. And the oath was to protect the public, to help those who are injured. And you see that first officer, when he falls, his oath, his heart, his duty kicked in, and he was ready to drop down and give aid to that man. The problem is the person behind him looked more at a mission rather than his duty to give aid. Okay. And he grabbed that individual and put him back on the line and put him back to the mission, when the real mission should have been to give that man aid. And that's where they failed.
If that is the case, how do you think it should have been handled?
I think once the situation is made safe, you're supposed to render aid. I think the very basics of it, like the other gentleman said, is to render aid. In that particular case, you have different roles or different ranks. So if that gentleman needed to job to render aid, the man behind him or the person behind him could have filled that gap as they're clearly looking like they're approaching protesters. When I went through the FTO program, Field Training Officer program, it was all about compassion. That was part of your field training. I don't know now, being that I've been out for quite a while, but it does look like that it's more mission driven, it's more get the job done, and somehow we've lost track that we are really policing our aunts and our uncles and our brothers and our sisters, and there has to be that level of compassion. You have to be aggressive, you have to be able to take care of yourself and the public, but you have to be able to dial it back a little bit when it's time to have that compassion in place.
So when we're in that mode right there, so those officers have formed a line, okay? Let's just say you have a riot line, and they have one goal, and that is to push that line wherever they need to go. A lot of times in that situation, we're not trained to take care of that down person, all right? I'm just gonna admit it. That first line moves the crowd, and the line behind it gets in and makes an arrest if they need to snatch somebody and actually secure them. I've seen a lot of training, and it doesn't address that guy that falls down. So that could be a training issue.
Wow, so it could be a training issue. It seems to vary from place to place, because we do in some cases see police officers render aid and really respond to needs in a more compassionate way, and then in other cases it does not. Is there a variance in the way that we train depending on the region or the precinct that we're with? Is there any consistency in the training from place to place? Because this is the thing that I'm thinking. At the end of the day, what we have here is a loss of trust. And as far as I can tell, trust is established through consistency. And if you don't have consistency, you can't rebuild trust. How do we get that predictability? And how do we weed out those particular people who refuse to be trained?
I spent 15,085 days wearing a uniform. That's 41 years and 4 months. It's a heart and a head issue. If you are a self-confident person and you got a spirit in your heart to take care of people, nothing stops you from doing that, and you have to run against the institution. But if you're an institution person, you understand that if you go against the institution has a way of correcting you.
So there are consequences for being an individual. How tight is that pressure? Because obviously you have to have a fraternity. You can't be out there driving at 2 o'clock in the morning with somebody you can't trust. There has to be a fraternity amongst the police department. Does that fraternity become more important than your humanity? Which signal is feeding you? The fraternity to your brethren? Because on the other hand, we're looking at George Floyd, who this guy has got his knee in this young man's neck. And all of his other fellow police officers are watching. Nobody's saying, whoa, man, you're going too far. You're going off. Describe that pressure that's on the police officer to be loyal to the blue rather than his humanity.
There is a fraternity, but not all fraternities are bad. Not all parts of it are bad. So when officers generally speak out historically against an officer doing wrong, that officer gets chastised, he gets his backs turned to him, he doesn't get covered on calls, different things like that. So it does happen. That's historic in our industry. But it takes the individual who loves man to change that. And his calling is not to his buddies around him, it's to a higher authority, correct? So there's the issue. So that fraternity, again, has both good and bad qualities. We go to work with each other every day. And sometimes you get that us against them mentality because we're out there to answer the calls, to make a decision to put somebody in jail or not. So it kind of becomes us against them to a certain degree. But then that stops, and then you have to become a man, a human being at some point.
When you say us against them, I'm glad you brought that up, because when you say us against them, I've heard a lot of people say more diversity on the police force will stop some of the violence that's happening in our community. But I don't think that's true, because some of the violence in our community occurs in the midst of diversity being there. What rides stronger in a crisis, the black or the blue? Dr. Delvena, I want you to jump in on this for a minute. I know you've dealt with soldiers, you've been on the battlefield, you've been in this business a long time, you've counseled police officers. What is your experience teaching you about how these police officers are responding in what sometimes looks like inhumane ways and other times looks like greatly compassionate ways?
So Bishop, and I'll add to that I worked for the Department of Justice for the Federal Bureau of Prisons as their chief psychiatrist and medical director. So I've been law enforcement for almost a decade. And so what people are referring to as fraternity is actually what we call social identity. So what we have with police officers and also military soldiers, people have a conflict with their identities. There's something called a primary social identity, and then we also have our secondary social identity. The primary social identity is who you are. The secondary is brought about based on your occupation. And so we're talking about police officers. And one of the officers mentioned, if you don't do what the others expect you to do, they may turn their back on you. And that's because from the time an officer is a recruit and they're brought into the police department, they're expected to do and say and act and behave in certain ways that's consistent with this, what people call the fraternity. But this is really the social identity of being an officer. And so at times you see those things conflict, because your primary identity, which is what we saw with the officer who stopped to try to render aid to that 75-year-old man, his primary identity of being this passionate person, having compassion and wanting to help an elderly person, that was his natural response. But then there was the secondary identity of, we have a mission, as one of the other officers indicated, we have to continue forth and do what we're supposed to do. And so the thing is this is the mental health aspect. When we're choosing what to do, when we're choosing whether we go with our primary identity or to go with that secondary identity, there's conflict, and a lot of times it's because the unconscious things come into play. So whenever we're making a decision, we use factors that are conscious, things that we're cognizant of, things we're aware of, and then there's the unconscious. Those are the things, the memories that are created from things that you've done, things that you've been taught, going through the academy, hearing what people say, seeing the things that happen to others. So that unconscious kicks in and it makes that decision for you. And so that person may not do what we're expecting them to do because of that factor.
Thank you for that. Here's my question. Between that conscious identity and that secondary identity lies this 8 minutes of a knee on a neck.
So that takes us to a whole nother set of another mental health aspect, and that's called psychopathology. What you saw in that, Bishop, was a psychopathic behavior.
I fully get that you could have somebody who goes rogue, who has a mental illness, who has a mental breakdown, doesn't give a warning, and they do something that is reprehensible in its sight. But what I am talking about is the 3 men who stood alongside and watched him, and nobody broke ranks enough to say, whoa, man, you're going too far, back off, or pull him off of that person. Because to me as a leader, you can't control what goes wrong. Things go wrong in life. Anytime you deal with people, things are going to go wrong. It's how you handle what goes wrong that determines who you really are. When it comes to handling that situation, I was more appalled by the 3 that watched than I was the one that pressed, because somebody should have stood up and stopped it.
Yes.
Go ahead, jump in.
You said leader. That's the key word. The fraternity, the head of the fraternity has to have the right kind of integrity to spread it across the board to the brotherhood. It depends on the leader of the fraternity.
Mm-hmm. As police officers, we go through an extensive amount of training, de-escalation, fair and impartial policing, all of the different topics. We get all kinds of tools to do our job safely, but what we don't get issued is a heart. And where you come from and your upbringing is who you are. And when you come to the police academy and you go through the training, you have to understand what your bias is and not let that impact the job you do and the expectation of the organization you work in to treat people with dignity and respect as if they were your own mother or your own son. And so to see some of the injustices that have occurred across the country aren't just troubling to our community, they're troubling to our employees who would not condone any of that type of behavior, who would feel obligated to step in and not only help that person that the force is being used against, but save that officer from taking action that they don't need to take, because perhaps they do need to go through some type of counseling because of post-traumatic stress disorder or some other situation that they've been involved with.
We need a value system. Those officers that stood by were wrong because they should have said something. And every police officer in the country watching that should have known, even when you arrest a suspect, if you injure him or you hurt him, you have not only an obligation, you have a duty to get him medical attention. And they did none of that. So when these things happen, we need to call these people out on this stuff, because that's not how we operate.
That situation up there, you had guys beholding to 2 things. Either it was the blue line, I didn't want to cross it and pull this guy back, or I hate this guy on the ground just as much as he does, and I'm good with it, which neither one of them are correct, right? Every one of those officers, and again, it's incumbent upon us as law enforcement officers, just as soon as this happens, to call it out. You don't sit idly by, and that's exactly what they did.
You know, what really broke my heart is that all those individuals wearing that badge and wearing that uniform did not see Mr. Floyd as the same thing they were. And that's a human being. In the old days, and I hate being sound like the old days were better, but they were, because we stopped the car, we got out of the car, and we actually engaged the public that we served. And that's what we have gotten away from because of budget cuts, because we have reduced manpower, because we are asking officers to do too much. We are not trained to do that. But a lot of talent of being a great police officer, like Sergeant Gilstrap was, is that you had to learn to being a cop. Being a cop is not learning in a book. Anybody can read a book. You had to learn how to be a human being, to the community that you serve. And we have lost that in this profession. And that's what we have to get back, or we are doomed.
Bishop, I have a comment, if I may.
Jump in.
I've heard him say you have to teach them to be human. If I have to teach you to be human, you shouldn't be hired to be a police officer. You shouldn't be hired to do no job. If I have to teach you to be a human being, there are certain things that are innate to us that goes without saying. Someone who does not display that or express that, they should be disqualified. And that's a part of the problem with hiring officers. And the other thing that police departments do a lot of, and this is what we see, supposedly they're psychologically screened, but a lot of police departments show disregard for an officer's history. They're called gypsy officers. So if I had 18 complaints against me in one department because of using excessive force, why would another department hire me? I've already shown a pattern that I have disregard for I have disregard for people. I have disregard for engaging people appropriately. So that's the other issue that we see in police departments too, is that they're hiring these gypsy officers. They show that they don't have the ability to cope with stress. They're easily frustrated. They're impulsive, and they show evidence of all these adverse types of mental health concerns or issues, and they get hired by another department.
Dr. Delvena, what you termed as gypsy officers raises a question in my mind. It reminds me of what the Roman Catholic Church went through several years ago with when you have a problem with a priest, we'll put him in another parish. When you have a problem with a police officer, they're hiding them in another precinct.
Exactly.
I want to move quickly because I want to take advantage of the few minutes we've got left. There was a news clip where a gentleman, I believe he was a part of the union, and he was speaking out for the police's union about the image of police, that in this current society where everybody is scrutinizing you in a way that you've never been scrutinized before, a lot of times when you would say you were a policeman, you got one type of reaction. Now you're getting another type of reaction. I want to play that clip. He's angry, he's upset, and he's talking about the loss of his image.
I am not Derek Chauvin. They are not him. He killed someone. We didn't. We are restrained. And you know what? I'm saying this to all the cops here. Because you know what? Everybody's trying to shame us. The legislators, the press, everybody's trying to shame us into being embarrassed about our profession. Well, you know what? This isn't stained by someone in Minneapolis. It's still got a shine on it. And so do theirs. So do theirs.
So obviously he's upset, okay? Obviously he feels shamed. Obviously he feels frustrated. Obviously he feels castigated by what happened with George Floyd. Are there any officers here who share that frustration of being lumped in a bag and having to defend your integrity?
Go ahead, Mike.
And that's the tough, and me and Terrance both deal with this every day. That's exactly how officers feel. You know, for the last 3.5 months, while everybody was sheltered at home, officers were out on the field. We were in the middle of COVID, you know, not just risking our life more than we already were risking our life. We were risking our family's life because we were possibly being infected and bringing it home to our families. But we showed up every day, and the nation, and we're very thankful, you know, made us heroes, and the other first responders and medical, the doctors and the nurses, and rightly so. And then 3 weeks later, by the horrible actions that every one of us have condemned, we are now vilified and hated. And so it's hard, very hard for myself as a president, and T-Hop's got that same phone calls, to motivate those officers, to remind them why you're here.
He's speaking passionately because he knows all of us are not cut from that same cloth, right? So I would be upset, right? If you tarnish me like that and I'm out here doing right, I'm going to stand for right because I know the majority of these guys are doing right. But the problem with that is we still have to address George Floyd in the situation that happened, that continues to happen around the country. So he's right in standing up for us that do the job right. And I'd back him all day long, but he's leaving out the other component that blacks unfortunately suffer at the hands of law enforcement officers a whole lot more than whites.
When you start talking about that, the complexities of the criminal justice system as a whole, as a whole, I'm not just talking about here in Dallas, but as a whole, has become a holding tank for the vast majority. 70% of African Americans incarcerated are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. Many of the prisons have become work farms that produce materials for for-profit stores.
This is not just a situation about George Floyd. There are more blacks in the criminal system than there were slaves in the mid-19th century. Per the National Academy of Science, 1 in 1,000 black men and boys will be killed by the police. And so someone said, I don't understand why they think that the video clip that you showed of the union president, why do you feel this way? Why do you guys think this? We think it because we've seen it. That's what the statistics show us in our communities. Black people feel under attack and under violent attack by the police. We see officers using violence regularly and aggression when it's not appropriate. I could give you examples of things that happened after George Floyd, after he was murdered. We don't see as a community that the violence and the aggression of these police officers, that it's being corrected. Even myself as a mental health professional, I can only see police officers who voluntarily come for treatment. In the military, we require soldiers be seen by a mental health professional regularly. There is no union in the military, but in the police departments, there's a union. And time again, the union has stepped in and said, no, you cannot require it.
We got police officers, they deal with traumatic situations on a daily basis and no way to mediate or to deal with those situations. So what would make a person with a camera on their chest, a camera in their car, and people standing around with telephones and everything like that, recording incidents, continue to do this kind of behavior? Because they are suffering mental illness, because they are overwhelmed, undergirded, and don't have the capacity to correct their behavior.
Here's my question about that. Okay, I buy the fact that maybe he went off the rails. It's a hard job. It's a horrific job with long hours and terrible things to deal with on a day-to-day basis. God only knows what all of you have seen and what your normal is really like and the things that you have to lay down with and the images that will live in your head forever. It makes good sense to me that somebody would fly off the handle and go off the rail. I get that fully. What I don't get about that is, one, you have 3 other men that didn't say anything at all about it. Number 2, the police records were falsified. They did not line up with what happened at the scene of the crime. They said he was sick and they were waiting on the help to come. He was sick because he had a knee on his neck. The autopsy report didn't agree with the other autopsy report. That goes all the way up the system. Yes. And when it goes all the way up the system like that, that's why people are out in the street marching, because it suggests that this isn't a one-off of an individual character who has some kind of problem. This is a sign that the whole system collaborates with itself to vindicate itself for itself. And while they run around free for weeks and weeks and weeks, no matter what happens to them, they will come out better than George Floyd did, because George didn't even get a trial. I'm not saying that he was an angel, but he never got a trial. He never got a jury of his peers. He never got to be represented. They executed him right there on the sidewalk. And that's what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. That's what happens to a lot of people, is they get executed on the sidewalk. But there's a big cover-up of information. Anytime you have to go back and change the police report, that is not a psychological breakdown. That's a system of dysfunction.
Bishop.
Yes.
That's what I've been saying.
That's
every police department isn't like that, but that type of behavior that we experienced the other day, this has been allowed at least 18 times. It's probably more than that, but that's what we have on record.
Mm-hmm. And this problem is multifaceted, as Officer Hopkins has stated earlier, because you have the issue of the crime being committed, and then the system. Well, we need to address a lot of issues, rules of engagement. In a lot of departments, they talk about activity. Well, we shouldn't just be activity driven. You have to do traffic enforcement, but do you have to go up there and write 100 speeding tickets? I mean, you need to be in other places that are important to be out there addressing the needs.
We're out of time. We've got to close. I'm going to give Dr. Delvena the final remarks. What are the takeaways that we need to take away from this conversation today?
Yes, Bishop. Number one, police officers must see themselves as community partners, and we have to reciprocate. We have to see police officers as partners in our community. We're all on the same team. We have to stop with the we versus them or the us versus them. We are all on the same team trying to keep our community safe. We also have to have better screening processes in place so that way we can appreciate when someone has the antisocial type personality and behaviors that can lead to excessive use of force, or if they have a pattern of doing certain things against certain communities. We have to have ongoing mental health treatment. They need to have those assessments in the beginning. It must be ongoing. Besides ongoing mental health care, ongoing classes and cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity is so important. If you grew up on one side of town or one side of the country and you never saw a Black or brown face, how do you know their history? How do you know how to interact with them? Cultural sensitivity teaches us to look at the here and the now, but also a person's history. Also, techniques and de-escalation. How do you de-escalate? And having the mental health services, it teaches someone to breathe through an anxiety or a situation that's provoking anxiety or a situation that's making them feel threatened. And I mean they as in the police officers. It teaches them to take a step back, to breathe, to count, and then to make a decision that's consistent with the threat that's there, that's apparent.
Thank you very much. You sound very well prepared, like you knew I was going to have you close it out. Great job. Great job to each of you. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for participating. Conversations with America. What I want you to walk away with is very simple and yet quite profound. You cannot live with people you don't talk to. If you only talk to people who agree with you, who share your perspective, you'll never be well-rounded enough to resolve any real problem. Until we come together and reason together and hear each other's perspectives without placing pressure on people to have your opinion about it, America will never be the United States of America. Stay tuned. We'll be back next time with Conversations with America.